Greetings, everyone. Your cartoonist pal Stan here. My audio is muted. Why is my audio muted? Hopefully, you can hear me. Someone leave a comment if you can't hear me because my computer just said I'm muted, and then my levels say I'm not. So I'm going to pretend I'm not. Your cartoonist pal Stan here with another episode of 50 Years in the Dungeon. Show I'm doing to celebrate the fact that 2024 is the 50th anniversary of the game Dungeons and Dragons, and that's been a very big part of my life as a hobbyist, cartoonist, a game player, and as a professional game designer and editor and manager of creatives. So, yeah, I've been working on it for a while. I'm having a lot of fun with the show. I'm getting to talk to a lot of folks who many of whom I worked with, some of whom I only worked near or I followed in their steps, and we're having a lot of great conversations. So I'm hoping that the audience is enjoying that too. Today's another episode where I get to talk to someone who's become a friend. I don't think we ever actually worked together. In fact, no, I'm sure we never worked together on D&D, though I know I worked with him on some other projects since then. This is author and editor and game designer James Lowder is my guest today. He's going to tell us about the early days of the TSR Book Department and the how the company and the game took over the far end of the fantasy and sci-fi section in major bookstores, and all the stuff he's been working on since. So I'm not gonna delay that anymore. I'm just going to open up the door here and bring in James Lowder. Jim, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
I'm right? You were not at the company by the time I got there in '97.
Correct.
Yeah.
I quit TSR twice in '92 and '94, so uh, so I was definitely gone by '97.
Right, but you were still. I mean, you were still friends with a lot of people. I ran into you pretty early on, and I feel like I've known you pretty much that whole time, to some degree. Um, but yeah, you're one of the big names that come up whenever the book department, the growth of the book department. we're
Yeah.
there in our conversation today. I try and keep things, very positive. I try not to
Oh, and you asked me
bang too
on
many
as a
drums.
guest. Wow.
Yeah, I know. I had you on, knowing that you have had occasionally, as you said, you left the company twice, and they were under sometimes strained conditions. So I don't want to not touch on that. Uh,
Right.
I would that would
But
be
we don't
dumb.
have to dwell.
Yeah,
We
but
don't
we
have
don't.
to
Yeah.
dwell on it. Go read
Um,
Ben Riggs. Read Ben Riggs' book if you if you want to see some of the details there.
oh, wait a second.
Slaying the dragon. Yep. There you go.
I'm reading. I've got the cover up because I'm reading the book now.
Excellent.
Um, no one ever interviews me for those books.
Oh well, we'll have to get Ben to talk to you for the next one.
Let's see. Becky is here, and Linnea. I suppose that 3 humans and 2 hounds are there in the lemon couch listening to us today. Ravenlore is there. Hi, Ravenlore. Glad to see you all in the live chat. If you are watching this live, you can pop a hello in the chat. Chances are pretty good that I will get to see it. Technology being what it is. But if nothing else, I will catch it after the show and appreciate you being here or just enjoy it. So, Jim, how is it? Well, you know what? I gave a really bad introduction to who you are. Why don't you just give a quick why is it that I thought to bring you on here?
I well, it's my relentless positivity. That's why. Let's see. The short version is I've been working in the industry since 1988 when I was hired by TSR in the book department. But I also did game design and editing at the same time. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
Worked for TSR from full time till '92, then as a satellite in the book department until '94. But I continued on after that in the industry, and I've worked for many of the, especially role playing game publishers. And I kind of live in that space between gaming and fiction and comics.
Right.
So I've worked for Devil's Due, and I've done 20 to 24 fiction anthologies, most of which, and nonfiction anthologies, most of which touch on gaming in one way or another.
Right.
And I worked for a while as exec editor for Green Knight Publishing and Chaosium. So on that side of the desk, and I'm back doing full-time freelance now as a writer, editor, and designer.
Yeah. Concisely said. It's so hard
Yeah,
to kind of, every time I go on when I'm the subject of an interview and someone says, "Tell us about your life," I'm like, "Well, is that all you want to talk about? Because that could
yeah,
that could be an hour and a half right there." Linnea says, "Remember, some of us don't know all the things."
right. Yes, yeah. So I've been really fortunate
Yeah,
that this has been my career.
right.
Working in tabletop has been my only full-time job. Since '88,
Lucky
and
you.
and yeah, super lucky.
Oh, Sue Wineline says hi. Hello, Sue. Thank you for joining us. All right, so let's start as we do with how you got to know the game of Dungeons and Dragons, because you had you had some interaction with it before you came to TSR, I think.
Oh yes, yeah. I had been playing since '78. So I started in '88. There were 10 years where I started playing in high school with a couple of friends. We played first edition Gamma World. I quickly got eaten by a giant radioactive weasel. They broke out the Holmes box set, and we played D&D, and that was clearly a better fit for me.
Right.
I brought my books to high school when I, for classes, and stuff, and got recruited into a game that way. Uh, a campaign for first edition D&D, which was run in a house behind a kiddie amusement park, which had giant dragons that breathed fire and giant and everything else right down the street from my house, King's Castle Land in Whitman, Massachusetts. So I played a long campaign there,
So
all
that's
through
where the
high.
D&D cartoon started. It's
What's that?
the opening scene from the D&D cartoon that
Yeah,
we
right.
live right
Yeah,
near
I
that.
mean, they did have a coaster, so a little kiddie coaster. So I played in a couple of interrelated groups
Mhm.
all through high school. Really fortunate for the people that I played with. Very creative. Many of them have gone on to work in the arts. Somebody's a professional still photographer. She works on all the Ben Affleck movies. Worked on Knives Out. That kind of stuff. She was our cleric. The people work doing museum painting, and one of the other people in my campaign, Scott Davis, later did a bunch of Marvel stuff for
Mm.
TSR, Marvel design for the Marvel superhero game. Uh, but we were all writing and doing comics and doing other stuff kind of parallel to the creation of the games. I went off to Marquette and that's how I got stranded out here in Wisconsin. And D&D was one of the things that I had in common with Debbie, the person I would eventually marry. She had been playing in high school as well. I met John Ratliff, who is familiar to people who pay attention to credits in
Right.
gaming and Tolkien studies. John was a grad student while I was an undergrad in the English department. We played a lot of Call of Cthulhu. We played a little bit of D&D with John, but we mostly played Call of Cthulhu.
Right.
Um,
For
Went off to
the record,
grads.
I'm still playing Call of Cthulhu with John.
Yes, and who wouldn't, right? I mean, um, so yeah, I've known John. I met him in a science fiction class that I was an undergrad, he was a grad student in, and I think the teacher probably still has flashbacks to that class, that
Wow, that would
classroom
be
experience. That yes, John and I both in the same class is kind of a lot. Um, so, um, but all this time I was writing, and I worked on the college literary magazine at Marquette, the Marquette Journal, which was also the publication department. Sue Wineland comes out
Hmm.
of the publication department at Marquette, as does Carrie Bebris. Carrie was an editor for the Marquette Journal after my time there. But I published a fantasy short story while I was there that was published later, collected in a year's best college uh,
Right on.
publication. Yeah, using my D&D character from high
Yeah.
school, right?
It's, I mean,
But I
so
also
you
learned a ton of
mentioned. Sorry, go ahead.
yeah. But I also learned a ton about editing there. The people who were I was the fiction editor for the Lit Mag, but the two co-editors, the managing editors for it, Pat Ferran, Mary Lynn Hendrickson, taught me a ton about how to work with writers and how to show
Right.
them respect and how to show their work respect. And because I was an English major, I wasn't working on the journalism stuff the same way they were. So that was a fantastic experience for me.
So I was about to say it's interesting to me, um, as I go through talking to more and more people, even people like you that I know, how often it turns out that at some point either your original game groups or the group you were with at college or the people you were interacting, that we wind up plucking groups of people eventually wind up getting pulled in together. I think it's parallel to what you see happen in the music industry when one
Right,
area gets hot for music because one superstar comes out of there. A lot of the other people who have have chops or have potential get the opportunities that everyone
right.
else around the world, around the country, around the world wants to know. How do I get in? And one of the answers is be lucky enough to be living near a genius, right?
Right. Well, or to be interacting with people
Right.
who feel like, and this has been something I've tried to do my entire career, is to try and uh, make sure that the ladder up to the professional levels is open and inviting.
Right.
So I Sue Wineland and I met at a I was doing Chattacon as for TSR. They sent me down there for the book department, and Sue was still in at Marquette as a student and talked to me after the panel and came up later for an interview to tour the company, and she met Mary Kirchhoff, and Mary kept her resume, kept her name on
Yeah.
file, and that was a big part of how Sue ended up working for TSR. Same thing with
Yeah.
John. um, Michelle Vukovic I knew before she worked for the company.
She was
Her
for
her
those who don't
her
know, she
brother.
was an editor, and assistant, and then eventually editor for on the periodicals
Yep,
mostly.
and she's gone off to work on stuff for Lucas and a lot of computer game stuff. Um, yeah, I mean that is part of the way
I
these
mean,
circles close.
I said Noah genius, but really the what it turned I the reality of it is you've got to find a way to get in the door, right? Even if you set up the ladders, anyone can get in. You've got to find a way to get noticed, and very often people look for personal recommendations. So it's
Right.
not unusual to find these blooms happening.
Well, and healthy companies, and this was something that once I did get to work at TSR, one of the things that I really tried to do, and Mary Kirchhoff was fantastic about, Mary was the head of the book department when I was there, um, that we opened up open calls and had blind auditions and did all kinds of things. And I was very active in reading the slush, which is the unsolicited manuscripts. So Christy Golden, Elaine Cunningham, Mary Herbert are all people who I pulled out of the slush,
Yeah.
and who went on to write a lot of stuff for the company. There are other people too, but um,
So let's see.
so
Trampus Whiteman has joined us and says hi. Jeff Crooks.
they
Jeff Crooks says something super nice. Let me see if I can get this to pop up on the screen. You guys are gods. Oh, demigods. I remember your names for the hobby shop at the mall. Names were like names on albums at the record shop. That's
Well,
the beginning of
we could
this.
the yeah. Thank you. I mean, it's super. As I said, I've been really lucky,
Right.
and getting into the book department when I did too is just incredible.
Yeah.
So yeah, so I had been playing since '78. I played all through college. I played when I went to grad school.
Right.
I played down at was down at University of Illinois for a couple of years. My original goal had been to get my PhD and teach medieval lit and film mass media stuff. I really loved teaching. The 2 years I was down there were great.
Yeah.
And again, it's that community thing. I was just talking with somebody who I was friends with in grad school, Craig Fisher, who is a full professor now. He stuck it out. I did not. But part of that community and the college community around that was introducing each other to comics and films and music and all of these arts things that they were enthused about. And it was always this and.
Right.
So yes, that's great. You like this, that's terrific, but also try this.
Yeah.
And that's the way it was at TSR as well.
All right.
Um,
So,
so
how is it that you did make that leap from being a grad student with your eye on academia to
yep.
being an editor at the start of TSR Book Department?
So I
Oh, and while
left
you do that,
grad
I'm going to
school.
start drawing.
Yeah. So I left grad school in May of '87, but I already knew that I was leaving, and I had my first interview at TSR while I was studying for my master's comps at Illinois. The first job I applied for at the company um, was in the computer. I mean, the convention uh, management. It was
Right.
for the job running Gen Con. Uh,
Wow.
so yes, in another universe, that's the job I got at TSR. Uh, I got down to be the second to last person for the gig.
Yeah.
I came down for the final interview while I was taking my comps. I got to drive up from Champaign Urbana 4.5, 5.5 hours to Lake Geneva for Mike Cook to basically just tell me you didn't get the job.
Really? He made you
I get
drive
back
up
in my
to tell you
yep.
no?
You got made me drive up. Not only made me drive up to tell me no, but made me drive up to tell me no and insult one of the people who had interviewed me.
Oh, goodness.
Um, yeah, that vaunted TSR professionalism. And it was like, well, I don't really know that person. They seemed really nice to me. But okay, I guess that's it then. And yep, that's it. And I drove back to Champaign Urbana. Um, I applied for a job in the department with Gene Blashfield Black.
Hmm.
Um, Gene was the one who actually was the foundational person behind Dragonlance and running the department under that. Putting that all together for the company.
Yeah.
Um, and I didn't get that job either. so, so Gene hired Eric Severson for that, which actually turned out to be great for the company. Eric was a really good editor and was Bob Salvatore's initial editor,
Hmm.
and really helped Bob shape, because Eric wasn't a gamer. And Gene was looking for somebody to work with the authors who were gamers. Uh,
Right.
Eric's background Eric's background was in agricultural journalism, and and so he was an ideal editor for Bob. So he could tell Bob, yeah, you've got all the game stuff down, but here's what the non-game audience would like.
Right.
And I think a lot of Bob's success initially, after Mary and Eric worked with him has a lot to do with their talents as editors. So even though Gene didn't hire me, it definitely worked out. And I was on call then. Gene wanted to do a Time Life book series about the 50th anniversary of World War II that was going to have war games in the back. This was a point where she was pushing hard for the book department to expand into this. And I was going to be the person who was going to edit those for TSR
So
if those ever
you didn't
if
get a
those ever got
job.
approved.
You didn't get a job, but you did have contacts and a possibility of work going forward.
Right. Yeah. And Gene Gene had looked at my writing and everything else too, and had said, yeah, you can maybe come and do some fiction for us as well. I'm leaving the door open. This looked really great. I actually got offered a job at New Infinities by Gary Gygax, which was the company Gary started after he left TSR. So I had interviewed in January of '88 with Gary and Frank Menser and Kim Mohan, with Kim being the one who really intimidated me because I had just adored what Kim had done with Dragon Magazine. I mean, that was the high point editing thing for me.
Right.
So
And Kim,
they offered. Go ahead.
Kim, who sadly passed away a little more than about a year and a half ago.
Yep.
I think if you talk to people who in our peer group who have worked at the company, he may be the person that is most highly regarded, just kind of as for his skill and his mentorship and his
Yep.
friendship, and
Yep.
it's. I think that he got recognition. He was not someone who went unrecognized, but he never got the recognition that he really, in a just world, would have gotten.
Right. Completely agree. And he didn't normally go to conventions. And there was a period a few years ago where he came out to Gen Con for the first time in a long time,
Right.
and got to hang out with me and Rob Schwab and a couple of other people who, I took the opportunity to tell him how much I thought, he had contributed to the industry in my career and how much I respected him. And he was kind of flabbergasted because he was just that humble. He wasn't,
Yeah.
used to people telling him that. So yeah, just amazing. Amazing. And a lot of the best editing that happens in the industry, you can trace lines back to how Kim trained people and the example that he set for platforming people and allowing them to have their own voices, which is really important to me. So yeah, they offered me the job at New Infinities, and it was going to be this hybrid game and fiction job because they were doing both, and that was my background. I had feet in both worlds. And then it turned out that the company was actually floundering, and they hadn't paid anybody in months, and they were hoping to right the ship. And while I was waiting for them to offer me the job, Mary Kirchhoff had been moved up. Gene Black had left the book department. Mary Kirchhoff had taken over, and Mary pulled my resume off the top because Gene had put it there and said, next opportunity that comes up, consider this person. And Mary cold called me and said, do you want to come in for another interview? And so I did, and then got to go tell Gary that I was going to work for TSR. Don, Gary never held it against me. That right, and then Kim either or any of the people that were working for New Infinities. I have a letter in my file. One of the people running things for them was Don Turnbull, who had been Fiend Folio and TSR UK. And Don sent me a letter after I told him and said, well, we've all gone through that phase. Just don't tell them anything, confidential from, your interviews. So I started at TSR in the book department as a lowly editorial assistant in June of '88. My first assignments were things like cleaning out the slush and Xeroxing manuscripts and quick, this Rose Estes book needs to be proofed over the weekend. well, welcome to publishing. Here, learn these proofreader marks by Monday. Um, that kind of thing. And this was right around the time that the book department was primed to explode.
So, when you got there, how many? What was the status of the book department? What had come out prior to?
So the Dragonlance books had come out. I mean, the book department had started with Rose and Jim Ward and Gene Black, Rose Estes, and Rose had brought in the Choose Your Own Adventure books, which had done incredibly well for the company, and through a lot of the 80s had generated significant money for them. And
Right.
then Gene and Margaret and Tracy uh, had done the first 6 Dragonlance books, and those.
Ooh, looks like Jim has. We've lost Jim. Let's bring him back.
There we go.
All right.
I got lost. So I was saying that so Rose brought in the Pick a Path, Choose Your Own Adventure books,
Right.
and then Margaret and Tracy and Gene Black did the first 6 Dragonlance books,
Right.
and the company was experimenting with some other fiction at the time in the mid 80s too. They had the Windwalker line, which was creator-owned science fiction and fantasy. That was where they had originally published Bimbos of the Death Sun, which went on to win a Mystery Writers Award.
Right.
And they had published in '87 Darkwalker on Moonshae and Crystal Shard in '87, early '88. And those were experiments. If those took off, the company was looking at, all right, then we're going to be a real fiction publisher. We're actually going to expand beyond Dragonlance, beyond doing just that line, to doing other lines as well.
Mm-hmm.
And they did well. Obviously, both Doug and Bob are incredibly talented writers. Just lightning in a bottle for both writers. Doug
Right.
from coming inside the company and Bob coming from outside the company, that Mary Kirchhoff had recognized his stuff from the unsolicited material that he sent in. So when I started, everything was primed for the department to become a major publisher, which it did within the course of a year.
So
So
I would say so. When you say it became a major publisher, what by what measure are you talking?
there were periods, and I'm trying to remember what the metric that Locus magazine used, and Locus is the kind of the Bible of science fiction fantasy publishing, trade industry magazine.
Is Locust
And
still
they
a?
would, yes, diminished from its high point, but still around and still doing good work. Um, the At one point in 1990, TSR was the biggest science fiction fantasy publisher in the U.S. Out of Podunk, nowhere, Wisconsin, the only person from the department who ever went to industry conventions were me when they decided to send me. We weren't New York. We weren't part of the standard thing, the standard publishing circles, and we were consistently publishing bestsellers, and not just genre bestsellers. The TSR fiction from 89 through 92, 93, the TSR fiction dominated bestseller lists. So they were selling for individual weeks as much as Stephen King and John Grisham and the Walden Books and B. Dalton's bestseller list for all books would come out for trade paperbacks and TSR would have a couple in the top 10.
So,
Every one of the books we were publishing for Dragonlance and the Forgotten Realms, and then later initially for Ravenloft and Dark Sun,
mhm.
were all but guaranteed bestsellers.
So an, a point of contention among people who were for the at the company, his
Yes,
beyond that, are, that's a story that almost never gets told, and almost everyone in the publishing industry knows nothing about.
right. Well, and part of it was Locus absolutely loathed TSR. Charlie Brown, the editor of publisher of Locus, refused to review any of TSR's shared world novels.
Hmm.
In fact, Locus got so annoyed at the dominance of the TSR releases in the science fiction fantasy trade paperback category, they created a gaming fiction subcategory so that the books could be listed and not take away from the real books that New York was publishing.
Oh my goodness, the real
Yeah,
book. And
the
we have been
real books.
suffering under that ever since.
Yes. Yes, and it's the sharecropper novels and what just they were unhappy. And I talked to people over at the magazine who told me it's never going to happen. They're not going to review those books, and they didn't. These were consistent bestsellers, and if they got reviewed, Science Fiction Chronicle, which was their competitor at the time, they reviewed
Mhm.
them. They would occasionally get reviewed in Publishers Weekly. But Locust, I don't know if they ever reviewed any of the books at TSR's height. And so the company was doing incredibly well and for the fiction. And by between 88 and 90, the book department was moved out from under games.
Right.
When I started, Jim Ward was my boss. And then Mary was moved out and the book department was moved out as its own thing, as a separate entity because it was doing that well for the company by 1990. And it was from 88 to 1991 was a golden age for that department. We did we launched new series like Dark Sun and Ravenloft. I was the lead editor on those um, initially, and those did incredibly well. I mean, these books were selling 100 to 150,000 copies, for like Ravenloft initially, which is
Right.
fantastic numbers. And they were being translated around the world.
Right.
Night of the Black Rose, one of my novels has been translated, I don't know, a dozen times, in addition to still being available in ebook and audiobook since 1991.
Well, that's
It's, yeah, crazy the number of copies of that book that have sold.
well.
Um,
If you don't mind, are you still getting royalties off that?
I am. And
Good for
I
you.
get royalties for the ebooks and the audiobooks. That was one of the things that and this is the thing. The first couple of years I was in the book department, man, I loved that job. I was so lucky because Mary Kirchhoff supported a lot of what I was trying to do.
Right.
So we improved the contracts. I worked with Mary and we improved the contracts for all of the authors. So, things the
So,
royalty rates went up from what they had been for
mhm.
Margaret and Tracy. And that was to help bring Margaret and Tracy back, right? And we could hold that up. The company hadn't given Margaret and Tracy a great deal. Bringing these up is a way to bring these people back. See, we want these authors to come back and work with us. Um, and so there were a lot of things that we did, improving the processes and improving the creator terms, that I think led to part of that renaissance for what the fiction was. And the fiction did just get steadily better over those 3 or 4 years.
So,
Um,
I mean, it would be interesting. I'm in no way second guessing what you're saying, but it would, for the people who are new to this. what were the terms before, roughly speaking, and what
Well, I mean,
was
so
the
instead of getting a couple of percent, you would get 6 or 8, which was closer to what 6 or 8% of your cover price,
right,
um, which is closer to what you were getting in New York, right? And the advantage that TSR had was, okay, so your royalty might not be as high as you would get in New York, but if you write one of these books, you're pretty much guaranteed to sell 100,000 copies out of the gate.
right,
That's a lot of money.
yes,
And there's and as I said, and they're still selling. And I get a check from Hasbro a couple of times a year for money that they still pay me. And
very
you
nice.
know, which is great. And I would have loved to have seen that actually expand to the game department, where they should have been doing more royalties and things like that as well. Um, but that rolled back after Mary left and other people came in. That push to improve the creative terms kind of rolled back at the company, in
Yeah.
part because they were having financial problems, and it's easier to not pay people than pay them, I guess. uh, so so
I mean,
but
it's totally fair to say that the history of TSR Dungeons and Dragons, and particularly at TSR, is rife with this things you see at any kind of company that has that kind of massive success.
right.
The massive success, and all of a sudden, the people in the C-suite realize, hey, we could make some more money, and the way to do that often is at odds with
Yep.
what's going on in the creative department.
Yep. And that's one of the interesting things if you look at the history of how the fiction interacts with role playing games. The
Right,
fiction is created. Role playing games are much more like films in how they're created. Frequently, they're much more group efforts. Fiction is, usually a solo or a couple of authors, and they're credited differently. They were getting different royalties.
mm-hmm.
They were laying down narratives that were at odds with the idea that the role playing games were going to be open for how people played them.
Yeah,
So when we did Avatar, it changed how people could play the Forgotten Realms. And that's, there are advantages to that for how you're building the intellectual property around the Forgotten Realms. There are disadvantages to that for what you're doing to the world and how people play it in their home campaigns, because
right.
you're channeling what's essentially an individual pursuit. Their
Yeah,
realms isn't going to necessarily follow what you're doing at the corporate level.
yeah. I was having a conversation with someone the other day about uh, adventure writing, and I thought that I said something that I thought, well, this kind of speaks to the difference between writing fiction and writing game material, and doing
Right.
whether it's adventure or supplement design. When you are doing game material, you are setting the table. You're setting a buffet, and when you are writing a piece of fiction, when you're coming at it from any story centric, specific story centric, you are serving a meal.
Narrative centric. Right. And that's it. Right. So when you're designing those scenarios and you're designing any kind of game stuff, you have any number of invisible co-writers who are going to be around the table playing that material that you have to account for them and leave them room to play,
Right.
rather than define what they're doing for the narrative,
Right.
for their game experience. So and that's where the book department, the prominence of the fiction in the early 90s for some of the worlds became a problem, right? There had to be there eventually had you have to have a balance that leaves your players enough room in the world to tell their own stories.
So that was
um,
um, in my experience when I came to the company. there was a real there was a real tension between the book department and
Oh,
the fiction
yes.
department.
Oh, yes.
You're aware of this. The,
Oh, I was the guy who lived in that space, man. And that was part of the reason why. So, I'd said Eric Severson was hired because he had editing experience and was a great outside the gaming market editor, right?
right,
So he could bring that experience to help Bob, who understood all the gaming stuff. Um, I was the person who was hired because of my foot in both worlds. And so I was part of the the game department right from the start. I mean, I was looking at some of the credits I published in '89, which was a year after I started. TSR published 12 adventures. I have credits in 6 of them. I edited the last 2 B series Carl Sargent first edition things. I worked on Avatar. I edited a Greyhawk module. I ended up working on Monstrous Compendium. I worked on Hall of Heroes. So I was living in both departments. Those were all freelance, but I spent a lot of time working in both departments,
right.
and that was something that they the company wanted me to do. So when they launched Dark Sun, I was the person who was going to, be the fiction line editor for that because I could speak to all the parties involved. Same thing with Ravenloft. So I wrote something for Dark Lords, but I also was doing the fiction. So,
So let
um,
me now. I want to ask a question, and I kind of am curious into both your answer now and how you think it has changed over the years. And that's when you're looking at doing fiction, role playing fiction.
right.
What is the I say this like an absolute, and I know it's not an absolute, but what is the proper mixture between the rules and the the narrative and the text?
It depends on what you want the book to do, right? I mean, because I've done everything from close to novelization of game material
Right,
to the All Flesh Must Be Eaten anthologies that I did for Eden Studios, which are branded as game related fiction, but are all creator copyrighted stories that actually have no overlap with the game.
right.
Those are in the spirit of the game. These are the types of stories that you can tell. And those did great things the book sold really well. They got great reviews. They got great reviews in places like Locus, where that was early 2000s before there were a ton of zombie fiction things out there. That was a time that it did exist. Um, that that and a lot of the reviews were kind of baffled, right? These are game related fiction and they're just good stories. We don't know how to deal with this. Um,
It's a unicorn. It's a book
exactly.
of
Yeah. Wow.
unicorns.
And there are 3 of them. Um, so it depends. I mean, ideally, what you have to understand though is at base fiction, and you touched on this earlier. Fiction is not role playing content. You can
Right.
open up windows to the world with it. You can illuminate the setting with it. You can illuminate the game with it. You can illuminate what the spirit of the game is with it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but it's not game material, and it's a mistake if you think that it is game material.
Yeah.
That's where a lot of times you get into trouble, where the prose tries too hard to replicate the gaming table experience, and
Yeah.
that's where you can hear the dice rolling on every page kind of thing. where I'm going to explain all the spell components and everything else for
Right.
this, and it
Right.
and it bogs it down as fiction because it's a different media and it's got different demands, and the audience interacts with it differently. The same thing with
But
comics, the
so
same thing with a film,
let me take the opposite side of this just for the purposes of our conversation.
right?
Uh, it becomes more problematic when you have a character. This is supposed to be set in the game, and because you're running off the needs of the narrative, the characters start doing things that are absolutely impossible for
Yes,
a character that cannot be replicated in the game.
yes. What is Artist Simbear's class?
Yeah.
Good question. It depends on what chapter in the book it is, I guess.
Right.
What's his alignment? Well, it starts here and it ends here, and that's because fiction does something different than a game does. So ideally, when we were doing this stuff at TSR, we our goal was to not overtly break the rules of the game.
Right.
We didn't have to. The stories didn't have to support them, but we tried to not overtly break the rules.
How
That
do you
was
work
that was
with a novelist in the so when you're saying we're getting all these new novelists in who
yeah.
are not game related. I
Yep.
Again in this case, Bob being the unicorn of someone who is both. Uh, what do you say to your writers vis-a-vis the game? How do you work with them on that?
Well, I mean, and this was something that I had mentioned that we developed this over time,
Yeah.
where initially, you need to hand them a single set of comments that cover everything, right? That cover all of the fictional stuff, but also cover the world and design things.
Right.
So you can't do this. This is this god. This is, in Waterdeep, this is how this political structure works. And if you're doing a good job as an editor, those become just part of the standard review. That's folded in with the with just the storytelling comments
Right.
and the prose and copy editing comments and things like that. So writing licensed anything, writing licensed fiction, doing licensed comics is difficult because you're actually serving two overlookers
Yeah.
where you've got your role as an editor is to make this a good novel, but it also has to serve the intellectual property that it's being licensed from. So you can't blow up the moon and you can't do things
Right.
that are not in the spirit of the game. So, that's challenging. So for writers who can do good shared world fiction, it's a talent. It's a talent, and you can
Yeah.
see and you can see the people who actually took it seriously. Elaine Cunningham's a great example. Elaine and Christy Golden, Mary Herbert as well.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Mary wasn't a gamer, but she really dug into the Dragonlance lore when she was doing that. Same thing with Christy has done a lot of gaming stuff since, but she really dug into the Ravenloft stuff. Elaine dug into the Forgotten Realms stuff. They were willing to do that work to do that heavy lifting to make their fiction live in that world.
What just for uh, I'm getting three questions at the same time. Straight it out, Stan. Get it straight. So what do you hand someone like that to begin with for understanding? I mean, you can't say read this whole box set.
Well, at the time, I mean, we would, that was the gray box set was pretty much the standard thing to look at. Um, and your role as editor in that is to guide the writer toward the resources that will help them and not turn on the fire hose and overwhelm them.
Right.
And so over time, of course, that becomes more and more difficult because there were
There's
all
more
of
stuff.
two Forgotten Realms novels when I started, uh, and now there are more. Um,
Well put. Well put.
so but the other part of this, and this is one of the things that's amazing about TSR and other people, Jeff and Zeb and Tracy and some of the other people you've talked to have mentioned this as well. We, the people who ended up working for the company, got dropped so quickly into the deep end of the pool when you started working there.
Yeah.
Um, I I started as an editorial assistant, and my first couple of jobs, I've still got my monthly reports that I did for Ward and Mary, and I was looking at them, and I went from editorial assistant
Mm,
Xeroxing stuff and asking, "Hey, I'm proofreading this book Stormblade by Nancy Burbrick, which is an early Dragonlance novel that Margaret Tracy didn't write. It's the second Heroes novel.
mm.
And hey, is Dragon High Lord one word or two words or hyphenated? Good question, Jim. Go write the style guide." And this, so that's that's my first month is stuff like that. And then within 3 months, I was handed the Avatar trilogy as an editor, um, which was which it turned out to be one of the most important books or trilogies that the company was going to do. Over the next 2 years, became the first Waterdeep. Troy Denning's book Waterdeep was, I believe, the first New York Times bestseller
Mm.
that the company had for at least for the realms. Again, which says a lot about how fast the company was growing as a book publisher. Um, but that went through copy editing Spellfire, working with Mary Kirchhoff and copy editing Spellfire, and then I did the second pass development editing on Azure Bonds with Kate and Jeff,
Mm.
under Mary's tutelage. She had done the first pass edit on it. They had revised it. I got to mark up the second draft and then have my editor author conference with Jeff and Kate in Mary's office with her sitting there making sure I didn't do anything dumb. Um, and she had reviewed all my comments and everything else, and that it was great. She did a great job training me, but that was my entire training, other than what I had done on the Lit magazine and as a teacher when I was teaching in grad school, working with authors. Which there's a lot of crossover with that. Working with creators and working with students, it, there is some significant similarities there.
Right.
Um, but that was it. Before, oh, by the way, and now here you go. Here's Avatar. There's these three books that are going to be written at the same time by three different authors that connect together. There's no background. Oh, hey, somebody needs to write this material for Hall of Heroes. You can do that, right? Which is how I ended up working on Hall of Heroes, because we didn't have backstories for the characters. So Scott Cienson and I, who was the author on Shadowdale, wrote those at light speed. And I asked, and this was again, my interaction with the game department. I asked when we were working on Hall of Heroes, well, we're writing up all these Bob Salvatore characters. Has anybody thought to ask Bob to review these? What a great idea, Jim. You can facilitate that. You can cross the two worlds here. So,
Uh,
that was the sort of stuff that was, people just hadn't thought of.
I mean, you want
Um,
to think again something that remained true with the company for a very long time.
oh
You
yeah,
were just too busy doing it to write the rules for how to do it. All you did, every new person gets dropped in and hits the ground running.
your turn in the barrel, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And yeah, I mean that was, and because of the limitations, especially in the late 80s, early 90s, the tech limitations meant all of these jobs were incredibly onerous. I'm trying to coordinate Avatar with authors in different time zones around the country and Ed Greenwood in Canada for the modules, and then later DC Comics and the people they were working with. And, I'm getting told, don't run up the long distance phone bill.
There's another thing modern kids don't understand long distance phone bills.
Yeah, and that's it, right? Yeah, so don't. Yeah, there is no cell phone, there is no Zoom, there is no internet. I'm mailing manuscripts back and forth to authors using FedEx. Around the country and up into Canada. And so, the first editing I did was on Spellfire, Ed's book Spellfire, which had been caught between the switches in Gene Blashfield Black and Mary Kirchhoff. So Gene had solicited book A from Ed, which Ed wrote, and then Mary came in, and that book wasn't going to work for what the department was publishing. And so there were all these conflicts, and everybody talked like Elminster with ye and thee originally. And I got my first editing was to go through Spellfire line by line with a line editor and take all of the ye's and these out of the entire book. And then Mary and Ed came up with a negotiated settlement where Elminster could keep his ye's and these. So then I got to go back through the entire book with a line editor. And this is list. And put Elminster's ye's and these back. I hated that character for a long time. And this is a computer line editor. So it was L1 through 25, and it would list line 1 through 25.
Oh boy.
And then you would edit 15, and you would retype the whole line with ye and thee in, and hope you didn't add new mistakes in. And that was for the whole novel twice.
Oh boy.
So I went from, and that was within 3 months. Within a year, I was either the line editor or getting ready to be the line editor by 90 for Ravenloft and Dark Sun, and I was the series editor, not the line editor. Line editor is technically something else. I was running the lines,
right.
not doing the copy edit line editing. And I was doing all of the Forgotten Realms stuff that weren't Bob Salvatore and Doug Niles.
So, and how big had the book department gotten by that point?
We were still the same size we were when I started. So the book department at this time was Mary Kirchhoff as managing editor, 3 in-house editors, and 1 satellite editor, and an editorial assistant.
Who was that?
So
what
Mary Kirchhoff was.
We know.
Yeah, Mary Kirchhoff was running the department, and then Bill Larson was the senior editor in the department after Mary. Bill had worked for Western Publishing in Racine and had done Big Little Books and Trixie Belden and all kinds of cool series stuff. And Bill was old school publishing, had worked with people at Western when they actually did lead typesetting, who could read faster backwards than they could read forwards, and all had blue tips of their noses from lead poisoning. Those kind of stories from Bill. And he had been around for a long time and just hated the computer stuff. And Eric and I had to train him on the computer stuff. Eric Severson, like I said, had been hired a year before me, like a half a year before me. Was an ag journalism major, and he was the non-gamer guy publisher. Bill Larson was handling Doug Niles's books. He leaned toward a lot of the historical stuff. He was much more interested in mystery and things like that than fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other editor, the satellite guy, was Pat McGilligan, whose day job was writing entertainment biographies, Hollywood serious biographies of Clint Eastwood and Jack Nicholson and Fritz Lang and things like that. But he also was the primary Dragonlance editor. He worked a lot with Margaret and Tracy and with the other Dragonlance editors
Right.
who would the writers who would come after Margaret and Tracy, and then me. And then I started as the editorial assistant, moved up to full editor within 3 or 4 months, and then we hired another editorial assistant, Marlis Heasel, who worked in the department for quite a while. Eventually, the department expanded, and Rob King came over from the game department,
Mm-hmm.
and Sue Wineland got hired around the time I left. Or excuse me, yeah, around the
First
time I
time?
left, first time. And the first time I left because, um, my trajectory in the department from editorial assistant to running these lines, when Mary Kirchhoff went on maternity leave, I was put in charge of I was the interim managing editor of the department, but I couldn't tell anybody.
But that doesn't mean anything.
No, and Mike Martin. No, it was even better because I couldn't even tell the other people in the department.
Oh yeah.
My
Don't tell them. You're in charge of them, but don't tell them.
That's exactly right. Mike Martin, the VP over me over the book department, put me in charge of the department. I did the Random House Sales Conference as the book department rep, and I was responsible for all this stuff. And Mary and I were talking regularly. I was keeping her in the loop on everything. But I was supposed to go in and actually find out what everybody's, how they were going on their deadlines and everything else going on. And, that lasted about 2 or 3 weeks.
Go find out
And,
subtle like.
oh yeah. And that is peak Jim Lowder, nothing but subtle. And then, now I'm relatively suave compared to 1990 Jim Lowder. And so that eventually precipitated Bill Larson. I went in one day and stuck my head in his office and said, "Hey, Bill, how's that book going?" And Bill just said, "Why the fuck do you need to know?" And so
Sue Wineline says, I just want to say that not all of us editorial assistants got elevated quite so quickly.
Well, yeah, yes, that was true. That Bill. So I called Bill and Marlis and Eric together and said, "Okay, this is what's going on. Mike Martin,
right.
put me in charge. I'm not supposed to tell you. So if you want to get me fired, go tell Mike Martin I just told you, but I can't do this without letting you know." And Bill said something salty and, "Why the hell didn't you just tell us from the start?" And went back to his office, and it was all fine. Everybody was completely cool with it. But when Mary came back, and this is why I quit the first time, ultimately, when Mary came back, she was actually supposed to be promoted because the department had done so well,
right.
Up to, a higher level of management. And I was going to be promoted to managing editor of the department. And for whatever reason, upper management decided they weren't going to promote Mary, and that flowed downhill, and I didn't get the promotion either. And that was sort of like, okay, well then, I got all this stress. I did this for, however many months.
Right.
I'm done. So I quit. And to Mary's credit, she came up with a way in which I continued editing for the company, and I was doing freelance for other places. I did some stuff for White Wolf and writing fiction and stuff for other people. And I was at that time writing novels as well. So I was writing Night of the Black Rose and Prince of Lies and things like that. And those were all done off the clock.
Oh man, so before the show, when we get ready to go, I often tell the guests an hour is going to go, and we're not going to get half through what we want to talk about. And
right.
we're over an hour now, and we haven't talked about. You just mentioned Night of the Black Rose and the other things
right.
you've written. We haven't talked about really any of the things you wrote.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and that was actually part of, the Avatar thing too, right? So that was such a disaster for the way the company structured how that trilogy came together
Right.
that the second author ended up being replaced. And I plotted, and then Scott Jensen did a draft, and I wrote big parts of the second draft of Tantris,
Right.
because the process had ground through the second, the original second author. And then, so that was sort of my audition for the department, for writing. And I got to audition for Crusade, which I wrote, and then I got Night of the Black Rose because, again, there was a problem with the author. I didn't want that book to happen,
Right.
which is the ironic part is, I didn't think they should be using the character
Right.
against
I
Margaret
mean,
Tracy's
that
wishes.
there's
And
so much at that. I mean, to go back to our, you can look at it at a micro level and what was actually happening in that book, and kind of a macro level, like our conversation was going on earlier. What that says, or what the concerns are when you try
right,
and do what that book did, which
right,
is cross these two streams, which are supposed to be separate things.
right. And take a character that Margaret and Tracy feel very strongly about and they had created in their name, but it's worked for hire and the company owns it and can do whatever it
Right.
wants with it.
Right.
And so I'm arguing inside the company, we shouldn't be doing Night of the Black Rose. I'm the Ravenloft line editor. You guys should listen to me. They
Right.
totally didn't listen to me. Because it was on one level a good idea. I mean, it was, the character fit with Ravenloft really well.
Yeah.
So, what ended up happening was there were problems with the person who was hired initially to do that book. They left the project, and I tried desperately to get another writer to do that book. And Mary Kirchhoff called me into her office at one point and said, "It's on the schedule. Somebody's got to do it. You're the only
I hate
person."
that. I only got to write a couple of things for, it was we were out in Seattle by that point,
Yeah.
but
Yeah. Yeah.
the, both of the things that I got to write were already on the schedule
Yeah.
before I did an outline.
Yep.
And, I mean, certainly that put a fire under my butt, but
Oh my
what a
God.
way to write your first, or any novel, let alone your first novel.
Right. Right. Yeah. So I mean, we had done, and this again came from my experience with the journal at Marquette. One of the things we instituted in the book department, especially because the books were so successful, was a blind audition process that
Right.
everybody in the company had to do, including me. I got Crusade. I submitted for that blind. The editors reviewed it with my name taken off of it. They didn't know whose was whose for
Right.
all of that. Marlis kept the files where the numbers that were on them were attached to the names, and she would shiv you if you went near that file cabinet. Um, she wasn't kidding. And So and I thought that was completely
Yeah.
fair. And it was fair for the other people in the department, in the game department, who later got book contracts that way too. And it varied it, and it brought a lot of people in from outside. So yeah, that was Night of the Black Rose is something. And
So,
uh,
and for those, as we were reminded earlier, who may not know, can, what can we do a quick kind of more specific um, summation of what we're talking about with Night of the Black Rose?
so Night of the Black Rose was, Margaret and Tracy were unhappy with
Margaret
the
Weiss
way
and
in
Tracy
which,
Hickman.
and yep, we're unhappy about the way some of the Dragonlance stuff was being handled. They weren't being consulted over any of this. The company was, meantime, trying to bring them back more fully to writing stuff. They were very successful in New York. There were reasons to have them be the people driving the vision for Dragonlance.
Right.
And so the company at a C-suite level had decided, we're going to do these Ravenloft novels, which I thought was great. The first one's going to be tied to the Forgotten Realms, because right now that is our powerhouse line. But we're going to create a new character. Jander Sunstar and Christy Golden got to create that character and make it hers. That's the character from the realms that gets pulled into
Right.
Ravenloft
It's just
and interact with Strahd.
right. So one of the things that folks may not know is when Ravenloft as a setting was created, part of the vision was this: it's outside of the realms of all these other game worlds, which are separate,
Right.
but it touches them all. And if you
Right.
are evil enough in a game world, you might get pulled into
Or if
Ravenloft,
you're a hero,
or
or
if
if
you're a
you're a
hero, yeah,
hero and you walk into the wrong bank of mist,
right,
you end up there too, and you can't get out. And so yeah, Jander was the character because Vampire of the Mists, which was Christie's first novel, was supposed to be focused on Strahd.
mm,
Christie got to create Jander as the foil character that interacts with Strahd,
right,
and so that was great. And then they decided for Dragonlance, the Tide of Dragonlance, we're going to pull Lord Soth from Dragonlance, from Krynn, and he's going to become a Dark Lord in
right,
Ravenloft.
yes. And part of the
And
reason was that the story had been done. They weren't working with Margaret and Tracy right now, and Lord Soth was
right,
just he was not part of the main story, and he was
just hanging out,
right,
right? They weren't really doing anything with him. He was sort of laying fallow and a very interesting,
right.
compelling character.
It's a very interesting
And
character that wasn't being that didn't no one had plans for him, and it was
right,
just this
exactly. Yeah, nobody who was directing things at the time had plans for it. So that was the plan. And so we went through the whole thing where somebody got the audition and got the assignment, and their proposal was okay, and that didn't work out. So we solicited a bunch more proposals. I actually, the first conversation I ever had with Margaret, and this is totally not uncomfortable at all, was calling her and saying, if you and Tracy want to write this book,
right,
I would make sure that you got to write it. Or if you want to review all of this material as it's being done,
right,
I will fold your comments into the feedback on the book. So at least it won't screw up the character for you.
yeah,
And they passed, and I
right.
absolutely
I
understand
mean that's
why. I mean,
that again.
you know,
That's one of those things that happens. I mean, you did it because you were good at your job and thoughtful for the authors, but from the company's perspective, they don't really need that, and from the writer's perspective, really what you're saying is, hey, do you want to do this free work so that because no,
yeah,
no,
well,
not that
initially
that's
it
what
was they were going to be assigned the book, so
yeah,
they would have gotten paid for it. They could have written it, or
right,
Tracy could have written it. But they were so angry about the whole thing happening. So where we left it was, we solicited a whole bunch of other proposals, and they were all, we're going to turn Soth into this, and they all completely changed the character. And so I ended up being the person to do it. And if you look at the way that book is written, uh, Night of the Black Rose is a meta-textual book about Soth, where the plot is, and this is a spoiler, I guess, but the plot is
it's
he
long enough.
forgets his
Spoilers are okay.
he forgets his story. I mean, that's the
Yeah,
course of the arc of the book is that's his torture. He forgets his story. He forgets who he is, and that already sets up the mechanism. And I told Margaret and Tracy this at the time, that if you ever want him back,
he
he
remembers.
remembers his story, and that's the escape mechanism. It's built into the book. He's being tortured by false versions of who he is, which is this whole, that's playing into what Margaret and Tracy felt about it too, right? So that put that English major to use. So
All right,
so
so we're
so
it's
that's where that came from, and the sequel came up back after Wizards bought the company, and Margaret and Tracy came back and wanted Soth back, and so Spectre of the Black Rose was written from that,
the,
and
the
it's built right into Night of the Black Rose. It's supposed to be. That's the point. It's supposed to do that.
All right, so we're getting a quarter after. I'm gonna want to move this on. You know what? But I will say we had a kind of an interesting conversation about this piece that I'm drawing.
Yeah,
Vis-a-vis the one I did last week. Both of them are by Keith Parkinson. Both of them are terrific pieces. Both are problematic because of the fact that Drow are represented in what is clearly, uh, you know, African.
Exploitational
Yeah,
frame.
they look like real world people of a certain with certain racial characteristics. Right?
Right.
They look like, I don't want to say African American because they look African whether it's
Right.
American or not. But they're drow, and that
Right.
has a lot of connotations. And last
Right.
week in my drawing, I opted to be faithful to Keith's rendition of it. This week, I am deciding to go more elven, and in the coloring, I'm going to get uh, more. It's going to be more like what we see in modern day interpretations.
Right. Right.
Um, and that we were having an interesting conversation about how, as creators in at TSR, you often are inside a bubble,
Yes.
and that it really, Keith and the other people working at Wizards or at TSR at the time did not understand the problematic nature of what was happening here,
Right.
but we're living with it for the next 40 to 50 years.
Right.
Um,
Right. Well, I mean, and this is, yeah, as I said, this is one of the strongest arguments that you can make just from a practical standpoint about why you need, diverse voices working
right.
with you on creative ventures, because somebody else is going to look at what you're doing and bring a different set of eyes and a different set of experiences to it and point out to you, that's not your intent.
Yeah.
So this is why you might want to rethink that. And this is, I, even when I was working at TSR, Karen Baumgarten at the time,
Yeah.
and Newt Ewell and some other people who were, um, uh, not like Newt, not there in the company, would provide feedback on some stuff. And that was actually my introduction to that sort of sensitivity and understanding that as a creator, you have to recognize that you've got blinders on,
Yeah.
that you're coming from your own experiences, and the audience doesn't necessarily share those.
So I'm going to take this off screen now and use that to transition this to looking at, we're having this. I'm having this series because it's the 50th anniversary of D&D,
Yeah.
and this, there are ups and downs and stumbles and triumphs along the way, but we've now hit 50 years, which is a time to take stock.
Yep.
Um, what uh, I don't want it to necessarily focus on this, but uh, what do you think as a creative property and as a something that has a fan base? What do you think
Right.
that we have learned over the years, over these 50 years? What are some of the differences between?
Depends on who are we talking about learning here.
No, no. I mean,
So,
the audience of D&D, what at the time, yeah, there were some. Even then, a lot of people uh, weren't bothered by what came out. It is only as it got on those paintings in particular. There,
oh, okay, yeah.
right,
So
yeah,
so yeah, I mean, I think if you look at what, and this is the nature of the game, it's actually one of the most brilliant parts of what D&D and role playing games are. Every one of those is implemented locally by the people who are playing.
right,
The game, the story that is created by the individuals around the table or on the Zoom call or wherever your
right,
group is. So as the game has expanded its audience and brought in new people
yeah,
and people with different viewpoints, um, they've pushed back on what were limited tropes and limited content, and that's great
right,
because that expands. That's showing actually a healthy growth in what the game does and what the game can be. It's a game that, I mean, by its nature, it's about individuals telling their own stories. And so that has to reflect the the diversity in that potential market.
And I think
And it has to be inclusive.
one of the things that Wizards has uh, they haven't always succeeded as well as they want to, but I can tell
Right.
you from having been inside within the last 10 years that they put a lot of effort into expressing that
Sure.
diversity and making sure it's in the game.
Sure.
Even that winds up having plus and minuses out once it hits the real world.
Well, and then the other part of that too is, and this is the other aspect of creativity, especially in commercial, where art meets commerce, right? The processes by which the works are edited, the way in which people may be rewritten, that the end result of a product doesn't reflect their individual voice as a creator because this is a corporate owned property, that then creates that same sort of conflict between individual, especially marginalized voices, and the corporate output.
Right.
So if you're going to invite LGBTQ writers and then you have an editor change their text and the text comes out and it doesn't reflect what they wrote, that's a problem. And it's something that needs to be fixed by processes as well. But the other part of it is, there's intent breaks down at the moment that it encounters reality. And so you can hope that what you did was X, but you can't guarantee what the audience is going to take from that.
Right. You've always got to, you always wind up learning, all right, we tried to do that and we 70% succeeded. We got to fix this
And
other 30%.
right, exactly. And so, you look at Radiant Citadel, right, which was a great effort at that, and
Mm.
having a group of creators who wouldn't normally be working on stuff for Wizards, and the entire way in which that was motivated and put together was correct. Whatever flaws it has are the problems where the vision meets the production process and the editorial process.
Right.
And that's going to, when you're dealing with a corporate intellectual property, that's going to be significant. It's going to be a huge problem.
Right.
So, um, but the game itself is going to deny any efforts to wall off the game from diverse parts of the audience.
Yeah.
Intrinsically fail because of what the game is. Because the game invites everybody to the table to tell their own story.
Yeah.
And if the release material from Wizards of the Coast or anybody else for a role playing game doesn't actively support that, then you have a problem.
Yeah.
Because the reality of the game doesn't match up with what you're doing as a publisher.
Right. And in addition, you have a problem because your audience is going to do what they want anyway.
Absolutely. Right. And that's the thing where people say, well, they're telling me how I have to. No, they're actually not. What they're telling you is what your potential
Right.
things are. If you want to leave Soth in Ravenloft, Soth can stay in Ravenloft. The that they're not telling you that has to be the, and it can
Right.
change next month. That can go back and they can decide, well, you know what, maybe we want to do something with this. Who knows, right?
Right.
And that's, they're not telling you how you have to play. They're telling you how you can play. And as the game gets more diverse, and as the covers are less chainmail bikini babes in high
Yeah.
heels standing in fields, that was always Mary Herbert
Yeah.
with the cover for Dark Horse. Her novel, there was a creator-owned novel we did in the TSR Books line. That we got Gabria down to where she was dressed pretty reasonably, except for the high heel boots, which was like, she's not going to be able to walk across that field. Mary Herbert fired off this letter to me when the cover flat showed up. It was like, okay, 80%, 90% victory. Man, those boots. Um, as you correct those and as things get better, what you're really signaling is what the game can be.
Yeah.
What it actually is what you play at your table.
All right. So we're at 50 years. What do you think the game can be in, I don't want to say the next 50 years because that's a pretty long way, but
Yeah, it
in
is.
the coming years?
Uh, um, What I'm hoping it will be and what I think it will be are kind of two different things right now. But what I'm hoping it'll be is it will continue on the trajectory that it has taken, where it is a game of shared storytelling mitigated by accessible rules. And that's always been at its core. That's what role playing games
Right.
are. I mean, it's not pure storytelling. It's not fiction. It's not comics. It's what we were talking about earlier. It's something else. It's a completely different art form, and it's that shared storytelling, which is an amazing thing. It was the thing that I immediately got the first time I played in 78. It was why I played all of those different games throughout high school and college and continue to play and still love being involved in this industry, especially where the storytelling intersects with other forms.
Mm.
Um, in as much as it can expand its identity of that, um, that would be fantastic. I would love to see that happen. And if you walk around, uh, you go to conventions now, one of the things that's incredibly healthy about the market, there are a lot of things wrong, but one of the incredibly healthy things is you go to the indie places and you look at what Ninth Level is doing and you look at what a lot of the other smaller places are doing. And they're doing these fantastic, very individualized voices kind of projects that are reaching to a much more diverse market. There are people getting platformed that never would have been platformed 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 50 years ago. What the games overall, role playing games overall, can do is remarkable. And so, in as much as the art form provides platforms and voices, gets those voices out, that's fantastic. I hope that is the way it continues to go.
I think in the end, no matter what the company does, I think that's the future for role playing. My hope is that D&D will not let itself fall too far behind on that. And
Right. Yeah. And
I
that's
think it
right.
won't.
That's
They
always.
they certainly have their eye on the right thing. I hope they will succeed first try rather than having to scramble.
Yes, and in as much as you try to wall off the game, or you try to make it a, you don't understand that it exists in a hobby market, and in the way in which the players interact with the game, where they don't want to be corralled and monetized and spend $4.99 for a Holy Avenger because bing, I just created one. Bing, oh, here's another one, and it didn't cost me $4.99. Bing, there's another one. I can just keep making these all day. And so that's the nature of the game that pushes back against that impetus for the corporate
Yeah.
identity. And I'm hoping somebody there listens. Somebody there pays attention to what the game actually is in the wild,
Yeah.
because it could be bad for the whole hobby if they move to that kind of walled garden monetization, World of Warcraft kind of model for it.
Right. And kind of, we had talked about this in a couple of the earlier parts of our conversation. It it is clear to me that the people that are making the products are in agreement, and the
Yep.
question is, and they want to do the right thing. They
Right.
want to follow, develop that vision.
Because they're gamers, right? I
Yeah,
mean, this is none of us are making huge amounts of money, and many of us could make way more money. I've been paid far more than I've gotten for fiction and role playing game products watching training videos when I did some writing for a law firm one time. They're just watching the training video made me more money than short stories that I've sold. So, completely, it's a completely different scale.
yeah,
But the people who are doing this, including the people who work at Wizards of the Coast, are gamers and they love this stuff, right? That was always the best part of working at TSR, was always the people and hanging out in the games library, and that sense of community and that sense of expansive, creative, and intellectual pursuit, because that underpins a lot of what goes on in these games too. Because the paper I did on medieval weapons development actually came in useful in my day job, or things like that. I've still got all my college textbooks, and damned if I didn't have to pull out my history of the English language textbook for a game editing thing a couple of months ago, because that's the nature of all of this stuff that we do.
Right.
They all want to do, and it's exactly what you're saying. They all want to do the right thing.
Yeah.
They want to make games they want to play. Um,
Right. Yeah. I don't think there's anyone working on the game that doesn't want to make something that doesn't want to sit down and play it. Right. That doesn't
right.
want to. That doesn't enjoy getting around a table and rolling some dice and telling some stories.
Right. I mean, and that was, the games library at TSR,
Yeah.
which is where, the 100 best books that I edited, the Hobby Games 100 best, came from, was because you'd be sitting in the games library at lunch at TSR and you'd say, my go-to example here, oh, I've never played Empire of the Middle Ages. And then Steve Winter would bring it in the next day because, what? You've never played Empire? Well, you work in this industry. So you need to know how to play this, and it was just whatever other games from there.
Yeah.
And people played role-playing games, and it's like you mentioned, still playing with John and those guys playing
Yeah.
Call of Cthulhu, right? Nobody sticks around in the hobby, in the market, at all if they didn't love what they did.
Yeah. As you say, the money is not here.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it is not a super profitable thing. There are exceptions. I mean, that was
Yeah.
part of
No,
the
there's
reason the
money to be
fiction.
made, but as an industry,
Yes, and that's where fighting, and that's one of my things too, coming out of the TSR stuff, is my hobby horse is that the actual creators need to be better contracts and paid better and have a long-term stake in what they're doing, in part because I've seen what that has meant for me for the novels, right?
yeah.
Night of the Black Rose, I still get my royalty checks. I don't get now. It doesn't mean it couldn't be improved. I would like to get money for the artist Simbear miniatures they're doing from Ring of Winter and all of this other stuff. But it's not a perfect world. But that's I would hope as the companies move along, they start realizing that if they want to keep creators involved, they have to do that if they want to bring those people in, so that they're working on material that they don't own outright.
Right.
Because then the motivation is just publish it yourself, do a Kickstarter, publish it for your friends.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, I know what I'm doing after this.
Yeah.
So we hit the hour and a half and rolled a little through it. So I'm gonna be out of consideration for your time and hope that maybe I'll get you back to do this again.
Sure.
Pull it in.
Yeah.
And is there anything you've got going on that you would like folks to know about? I know I've got a couple of links to projects you have in the show notes.
Yeah. So I mean, I'm back doing writing and editing full time, which is great. Roaming the freelancer wastes. So I just did a piece for a thing called the Dagon Collection, which PS Publishing released. It's a faux auction catalog of material seized from the Innsmouth raid at the end of Shadow over Innsmouth. And I wrote up a book called The Geometry of Nowhere for that, which I created for Call of Cthulhu scenarios that I've been running. It ties in with some fiction that I've been doing too. All creator-owned stuff. So that just came out in hardcover. It had been kind of hanging around for a while. That's really fun. And I did an essay about the Monkees movie Head, for Fantastic Flops with Chris McLaughlin. It's an essay collection about movies that were box office bombs that deserved better. And so I wrote
would
a lot
so want to
about
read that essay.
I wrote a lot about the industrial entertainment complex for that. Totally, off brand for me,
Yeah.
about the treatment of creators in the industry, which is really what that movie's about. So those are the two most recent things. I've got some other stuff that I'm working on, doing something for a couple of role playing products for David Larkins for Action International. I'm writing an essay about the intersection of 80s action films and role playing games, which goes back to my old Into the Dark column in Polyhedron that I was writing back at TSR and stuff. Got to keep pulling the film stuff back, and doing a scenario for the new edition of Cthulhu, which is the uh, ties in with the geometry of nowhere and those Call of Cthulhu scenarios and stories that I've been doing, which is cool. And that's the smaller publishers. When I talk to them about, they asked me about doing something, and I said, well, can I do this that ties into my fiction, and I would still own the characters and that stuff, and you can keep publishing it, and we can make a totally fair contract, but I need to own these characters and stuff. And they were like, yeah, sure.
As long as we can keep publishing it, sure.
Which is, I mean, if we can publish the scenario, and you get to own your stuff, and we all shake hands, and everybody wins. Yeah. So there are more publishers coming up who are willing to do that, which is fantastic.
Awesome. So before I move you off screen, Ravenlore I think this is a quote. After an hour and a half, Ravenlore says, "Wait, you wrote Night of the Black Rose, the novel?"
I did. And Prince of Lies, and Ring of Winter, and Crusade, and parts of Tantris.
All right. So, Jim, thank you very much for coming on. I really would like to have you on. We can pick up where we left off, or just have another conversation.
Sure.
Because there's a lot left to discuss. So if you
That's great.
will
Well,
hold on, I'm gonna take you off screen, and I'm gonna do my outro stuff, and then I can thank you properly. So there we go. There's a good 90-minute conversation with James Lowder. We covered a lot, and some pretty inside baseball, but I think it was accessible, even if you didn't know the exact details of what we were talking about. And it's an interesting, the history of D&D covers more than just the games at the table. And this what happened with the book department and the interactions between the books and the games is something I'm sure will come up in other conversations. So please check the show notes to see the links to those two books that Jim is currently working on, and maybe you can find him online somewhere. Follow him in the future. As for me, you know that this show has a free newsletter through Substack. 50 Years in the Dungeon.substack.com. As I say, it's free. There are paid levels too. If you feel so moved, supporting the show that way will certainly help me spend more time doing preparing and do more art. I was talking to someone this week who asked me if I was going to go back and do some other covers from some of the early 80s and late 70s. And my answer, of course, was, well, the conceit of the show is I'm moving up the timeline. So after I do 50 of them, I might turn around and come back. But if we have more paid subscribers, I can take that money and turn it into more time. You say time is money. As a freelancer, I can tell you that turns out to be a little too true. So, but it is free, and I encourage you to join it for free. And if you're so moved, I will tip my hat and say thank you if you want to become a paid subscriber. 50 Years in the Dungeon.substack.com. Also, if you want to follow the other things I do cartooning wise, going to my Instagram.com/Stanex is a place to go. All of the things I release publicly wind up there eventually, and you can dive in and find them. Or if you really just kind of like me, and who wouldn't, if you really want to join and find more about all the stuff I'm doing, I have a Patreon that, of course, also money-oriented. Patreon.com/Stanex, and in which case all of the stuff I do publicly gets sent to you in your inbox, so you don't even have to go looking for it. And you get more behind-the-scenes information. So there we go. Thank you very much. I will be back again next Wednesday for another interesting conversation. Oh, you know what? No, if you're watching this live, I will be back next Wednesday, not no. But if you're watching this live here on, what are we? It's the 8th of May. Um, because of a convention schedule for me, I'm going to be doing a couple of pre recorded shows later in the month. And this Saturday, I'm going to have a show that I'm going to be taping and I will announce it on the newsletter, which I talked about before. Here, I'll pull that up again in case you want to know now. 50yearsinthedungeon.substack.com. I'm going to announce it on the newsletter when and where that is happening. But I'll tell you the when is Saturday afternoon, May 11th at 2 p.m. Pacific is the time that we're talking. I won't tell you who the guest is right now, but it's someone I'm very happy to have a conversation with. And so there's gonna be at least one other taped show that I do for later in the month. If you want to know about that, you want to have the ability to watch it live, be in the audience, interact with folks. Sign up for the free newsletter because that's how you'll get the information. So that's it. Thank you again, everyone. Thank you, Jim Lowder, and I will see you all next time.